And as the title suggests, this talk is going to focus on Lucie Rie's life and work in relation to the natural world. And this is something that I became quite interested in as I was researching and curating and scoping the exhibition. I didn't start from a point of knowing much about Lucie Rie's work at all. We have a small number of bowls by Lucie Rie in the Kettle's Yard collection in Cambridge, so I was familiar with those, but really I was coming at it with pretty fresh eyes. And I found that the more time that I spent with her pots, the more it struck me that Rie's work seems to kind of constantly draw on the forms, structures, textures, patterns from the natural world. But I was also finding that in all of the literature that I read about her work, people regularly tried to decode the historic or human influences on Rie's work, whether that was Viennese modernism, Chinese Song Dynasty ceramics, prehistoric pottery, architecture. There didn't seem to be much acknowledgement of the way her work also absorbs influences from the non-human world, so the animal, vegetable, mineral world. So I'm going to start by speaking a bit about what we know of Lucie Rie's own relationships to the natural world through her life and her archive, and then using this as a lens through which to kind of relook at and understand her work and some of the pots that we have on display in the exhibition here. So Lucie Rie is very frequently described as a metropolitan or urban potter, whose work is aligned with the sort of clarity and minimalism of modernist design and the urban environment. And reading descriptions of Lucie Rie's work, we see the same words crop up over and over again. Elegant, refined, precise, poised, minimalist. And if we think of a Lucie Rie pot, those of us that are familiar with her work, most people will probably imagine one of these kind of archetypal elegant sgraffito-footed bowls. They're thin, precise, often kind of monochromatic, have this linear graphic sensibility to them. And this categorization of Rie as this metropolitan potter first kind of properly emerged in the catalogue for her 1967 Arts Council retrospective. And in the introductory text to the catalogue, the exhibition's curator, George Wingfield Digby, attempted to identify the particular idiom of Lucie Rie's work. And it was, he wrote, "Not rustic, but metropolitan. Her work had no nostalgic undertones of folk art. The style was that of someone conscious of modern architecture." And this argument has been echoed since by many others. In the 1970 edition of her book, Artists, Potters in England, the gallerist and critic Muriel Rose similarly emphasized the relationship between Rie's work and modern architecture. And certainly in Rie's early sort of formative years in Vienna, her relationship with architects and designers, whether that was Ernst Plischke, who designed her apartment in Vienna that was later kind of transported to London, but also Joseph Hoffmann, who was an important mentor at the Kunstgewerbeschule, where she studied, but also later he exhibited pots of hers in his own buildings. So these links to modern architecture have been emphasized repeatedly. And more recently, Edmund de Waal has written about Rie's work that it demanded an urbane setting. It was thin, exact, engineered in severe sgraffito lines of cross-hatching through manganese and tin glazes. Rie's and Coper's pots of the 1950s are not just made in and for particularly urban settings. In their abraded textures and density of colors, they are urban constructions too. And this is an example of the kind of thing that Edmund de Waal is talking about, the coffee service that we have on display in the exhibition in the galleries downstairs. But this particular dichotomy, urban potter versus rural potter, seems to particularly set up a comparison that's often made between Lucie Rie and Bernard Leach, who was frequently described as the father of British studio pottery. And Rie was conscious of this when she arrived in Britain in 1938. She wrote to Leach in 1939 and went to visit him where he was working on the Dartington estate in Devon. And Leach and his followers particularly promoted this ideal of pottery that was rooted in rural tradition, that was harnessing and in harmony with the natural world. In his 1940 treatise, A Potter's Book, Leach writes that the potter's attitude to his materials, and I might add to the technique, should be as delicate and respectful as a good gardener's to his plants. He should work with and not against nature. So as well as the pottery workshop being located in the countryside, in Leach's case on the road between St Ives and Land's End, the resulting pots should also be products of the landscape in which they were made, whether that was from clay dug from local Cornish clay pits, to glazes mixed from locally sourced minerals, or ash from surrounding trees and vegetation. But Rie's setup could not have been more different. Throughout her life, her pots were made in the centre of a city, firstly in central Vienna, where she studied and later established her own studio. In the early days, she had to transport her unfired pots across town via a tram to have them fired. And here we have images of the Rie's flat in central Vienna with those interiors designed by Plischke, and where Lucie had also a small pottery workshop. And I've also included Lucie Rie's kind of headed notepaper, which ties into this whole aesthetic of kind of urban modernism, with her address along the top there. And then later, as we know, from 1939 until her death, she lived and worked at 18 Albion Mews in Paddington, right in the centre of London, where she lived in a small apartment above her pottery studio on the ground floor. And she was what's been described as a no-shovel potter. So the clay that she used was ordered in bags that were delivered to her studio. Glaze ingredients she bought commercially from pottery suppliers or from chemists. And the finished pots were fired in an electric kiln. So while it's certainly true that Rie's work was decidedly urban in comparison to the Leach model, this picture of her as the metropolitan potter only presents sort of half the picture. Far from being this die-hard urbanite that was disconnected from the natural world, a look into Rie's life and archive actually shows that she spent a great deal of time away from the city, in the countryside, immersed in the landscape and its flora and fauna. So although she was born and raised in central Vienna, much of her childhood was spent at her mother's family estate in Eisenstadt, not far from Vienna. And she spent most of her holidays there as a child, walking, horse riding in the hills and meadows, picking fruit, foraging for mushrooms and berries, and photographs here. There's one of her on the left from 1915, show her kind of enacting this Austrian rural idyll on this country estate, where her uncle, known as Uncle Sandor, lived, and here he is on the right-hand side, hiking in some kind of alpine scenery in the 1890s. And later, as a young woman, alongside pottery, Rie's kind of primary hobby and passion was for outdoor sports and outdoor pursuits, particularly skiing, rock climbing, and hiking. And this seemed to be one of the main things that she shared with her husband, Hans. These are photographs from the couple's honeymoon in 1926, taken at the Rhone Glacier, with Rie posing in front of various very dramatic landscapes. And more photographs from the 30s of Rie holidaying with friends in the Italian lakes. And so Rie, as a young woman, seems to have been drawn to these activities that really brought her into direct contact with nature's elements at their most extreme and unpredictable. And there's an anecdote that later in her life, when a friend came to her and told her that he'd been rock climbing, she dismissed it as not proper rock climbing because he had used safety ropes, so it wasn't the real deal. Later, when the Ries moved to London and their marriage eventually dissolves, these activities become much less frequent. But it's still the case that in the sort of little time that Rie took away from work in the studio, she frequently went on excursions outside of London into the English countryside, whether that was her famous visit to Avebury in Wiltshire, where she first encountered sgraffito on Bronze Age pots, or frequently going to stay at the Coper's farm in Somerset after Hans Coper moved away from London. And this wonderful photo on the right-hand side, taken by the artist Stella Sneed, shows Rie in this kind of state of sunbathing bliss, which was probably taken on the Coper's farm in Somerset. And on the left-hand side, a snap of mine from the archive showing her picnicking in a field with an unknown group of friends. And also at her home in Albion Mews, as Helen has probably covered in her talk as well, she brought nature into her home and to the small amount of kind of garden space that she had at the front of the house. So she planted pelargoniums, geums, honeysuckle, as well as these vigorous climbers that have since completely engulfed the front of the building. If you visit now, it's just a kind of jungle of greenery. And inside the apartment as well, cut flowers, plants featured very prominently, potted houseplants, twigs, grasses, seed heads that she arranged on the furniture in her own pots, in Hans Coper's pots. So while Rie's affinity and love for the natural world is quite clear, it can be quite difficult to draw concrete links with her working practice. She was famously laconic when it came to discussing any of her influences or artistic processes, and her archive offers very few clues. She didn't produce preparatory sketches for her pots, and her studio seemed to function as a purely functional space, not a kind of source of external inspiration as some artists might arrange their studio. But there are a few small clues in the archive as to Rie's interest in nature and natural objects in the natural world that extend beyond her enjoyment of just being outdoors. And in particular, these objects that are in the archive at the Sainsbury Centre, which holds a small collection of art items from Rie's home and studio, including this collection of organic objects. So we have pebbles, minerals, crystals, shells, coral, and there are some feathers in there as well, I think. I've also been told that Rie had a large ostrich egg in her collection, which is kind of exciting to think about in relation to some of the kind of shiny pitted textures that you encounter in some of her work that really resemble the surface of an ostrich egg. And slightly more mysteriously, in the Farnham archive, this album of photographs of rock surfaces showing kind of lichen-encrusted rock faces. There's no record of who took these or where these came from, but it's tempting to imagine either that Rie herself took them, or perhaps more likely that someone gave them to her and she kept them as kind of sources of inspiration for her work. And with this in mind, we can really start to begin to see influences of the natural world throughout Rie's work, from her very earliest developments working in Vienna through to her final decades in the 70s and 80s. As early as the 1930s, Rie seems to have been particularly fascinated by the material and elemental qualities of clay and glazes, eschewing the kind of decorative and figurative pottery that was made by her contemporaries in Vienna in favour of simple vessels that had these interesting mottled and pitted surfaces, many of which you'll have seen in the show downstairs. And looking at her notebooks from her student days, they're filled with endless chemical formulae of glaze tests that she repeats and repeats with the kind of rigour of a scientist carrying out experiments. And the organic quality of these Vienna-era pots didn't go unnoticed. As early as 1937, a reviewer of the Austrian pavilion at the Paris International Exposition singled out what he called remarkable textured pottery like coral or sponge by Lucie Rie Gompertz. After moving to London in 1938, it was many years before Rie would return to making these more experimental single vessels. And as we know, to make ends meet during the war, she instead turned to making buttons for the fashion industry, initially producing the lamp-worked glass designs for the company Bimini, before developing her own press-moulded clay designs. And although these are a far cry from her more experimental Viennese work, they offered the opportunity for quite a different kind of experimentation. And again, we see Rie's interest in the natural world emerging in these objects. Whereas the Bimini button designs were frequently modelled from antique coins or cameos, when Rie took on coming up with the designs herself, they much more frequently looked to forms from nature. So shells, seed pods, flowers, leaves, fish, even seahorses. And many of these were also given evocative names that further kind of confirm this connection. So there was one design called lettuce, which was a kind of frilly rosette shape, another called osso, Italian for bone, which kind of suggests another sort of natural form. And Rie also made other small ceramic objects at the same time as her button-making years. So these furniture handle prototypes that were made for heels, which again seem to suggest kind of organic forms like shells or mushrooms or seeds. And here's some of the jewellery that we have on display in the show as well, which to me again recalls perhaps coral or shells. When we turn to look at Rie's pots, the references to nature are far less overt, but it's worth noting a comparison with Hans Koper, who quite regularly named his vessel forms, making much more clear their connection to organic forms. So here, for instance, we have examples of his thistle and poppy head pots. And I was quite interested to come across, illustrated in Tony Burke's book about Lucie Rie, this porcelain poppy head pot, supposedly also by Lucie Rie, but it looks very unusual for her work, but somehow connects to Koper's poppy head pots as well. But although Rie didn't necessarily name her pots in the same way that Koper did, she did occasionally give her vessel forms nicknames that give hints as to how she sort of arrived at her forms and thought about the vessel forms. So for instance, on the left-hand side, we have what she called her potato pots, which tend to be these very rounded forms, closed forms, generally accompanied by quite a kind of earthy glaze or palette. And on the right-hand side, what were known as her goiter vessels or goiter vases, referencing the strange kind of bulge in the neck of the vase. It's not always easy to tell whether these were nicknames that were given to her works by other people and that she then adopted, but she certainly did adopt them. And beyond these kind of specific named forms, Rie's work kind of constantly presents this interest in asymmetrical organic forms. Again, this kind of tension between control and chance, for instance, often taking bowl forms and squeezing them or pulling at the rim to turn them into a kind of ovoid shape. And this is particularly effective or suggestive, I suppose, in works like this one, which again is on display in the show downstairs, where the speckled glaze and the kind of ovoid shape call to mind a kind of speckled bird's egg. And also, as well as pulling bowls off center, making tool vases with undulating rims that have this sense of kind of upward growth and flowering outwards, again, kind of pulling the clay to almost the point of collapse. Beyond the forms of Rie's work, one of the things that makes them so extraordinary and successful, I think, is this synthesis of form and surface together, which she treats as a kind of unified whole rather than as disparate elements. And this, to me, feels very key to the way that Rie's pots have this ability to feel as though they've almost emerged into the world fully formed, or have kind of naturally evolved into being, rather than perhaps the leech emphasis on showing the hand of the maker or the process behind them. And the naturalist David Attenborough, who was a long-standing admirer of Rie's work, particularly singles out this quality, writing, "Their colours are muted greys and creams, delicate blues and mottled moss greens. Some are pitted and studded with tiny bubbles. Others have thick dripping surfaces with the immobile fluidity of stalagmites. When you handle them, they give you the feeling of homogeneity that you experience when you handle a pebble. You sense that their surface is not a thinly applied veneer of decoration, but an expression of their central substance." So throughout her career, we know she experimented with glaze recipes and surface effects, often exploiting the unusual results that other potters might typically reject as flaws, so pitting, pinholing, melting glazes. And this was heightened by the fact that she raw glazed her pots, which enabled a closer sort of interaction between the glaze and the clay body. It's been also suggested that the fact that she brushed the glaze on with a paintbrush rather than dipping her pots into buckets of glaze meant that small particles of the unfired clay would be picked up by the brush and further mixed with the glaze that she was applying, so kind of even further heightening this fusion of clay body and glaze. So the rough textures that she was enjoying exploring in her Viennese work in the 1930s began to kind of re-emerge from around the late 50s alongside an increasingly kind of earthy colour palette. And she also found that she could create these explosive volcanic glazes by adding small amounts of silicon carbide to her glazes so that they bubbled and exploded in the kiln, and these she called her explosive or volcanic glazes. And here I just wanted to return to this photograph of one of the rock surfaces in the archive and just how close it is really to some of the glaze textures that she achieves in her pots. And this particular unity between the form and surface in her vessels really reached its apotheosis in her spiral vessels, which she developed sort of sometime in the mid-1960s. And these were created by pressing together multiple balls of contrasting clay, which she threw on the wheel, which generated this integral swirl of colour that ran through the body of the clay, like a piece of stone or marble. And you can see on the right-hand side, inside the small beaker that we have on display, that the colour runs all the way through. And just as Rie often nicknamed her vessel forms, looking through her order books in the archive, you start to see certain descriptors or nicknames for the glazes that she used that again make reference perhaps to the influences of the natural world in her work. So here's an example of a page from an order book from, I think, the 1980s, where you can see she refers to a spinach bowl. And that's not a bowl that's used for holding spinach, but it references a particular glaze that she used, that she referred to as her spinach glaze, which was a particularly kind of sludgy, mottled green colour that you can see used on this bowl on the right-hand side. And another example of that is what she referred to as an orange peel texture. And again, you can kind of see it in this yellow bowl on the right-hand side here, which has this shiny but pitted, pinholed texture that resembles orange peel. But beyond the very obviously kind of textural and earthy works, even as we look at Rie's more decorative and graphic surface treatments, I think we can still begin to notice how they resemble patterns and structures from nature. So one example is this bowl from around 1947, again, which is part of the exhibition, which seen alongside some of the shells that she had in her collection, really start to resemble the kind of bands of colour and radiating lines that appear on the shells. And Rie's kind of iconic sgraffito vessels and bowls, again, an abstract and linear design, but one that recalls perhaps the rings on a tree trunk or the radiating lines on the gills of a mushroom. These two pots are a particularly good example, I think. They're probably the closest Rie comes to an almost figurative design on her work, particularly the pot on the right-hand side with this kind of skeletal leaf motif, which appears a few times on works and is said to have come from a leaf design on a Roman bathtub that she encountered somewhere. And again, I think it's worth noting that even in these more decorative treatments, they're still very integrated into the kind of surface of the pot, and they almost remind me of kind of imprints or fossils. They're not applied decoration with a brush. They're kind of etched or inlaid into the very surface of the pot itself. And in these cases, it feels like less the textures and colours of the natural world, but more the kind of underlying patterns and structures of the organic world. And this was a preoccupation that was shared by many of Rie's contemporaries, whether that was artists and designers in early 20th century Vienna or people working in design in mid-century Britain, particularly the kind of Festival of Britain style. An example being Lucie Rie and her textile designs, which really frequently looked to the structures and patterns in nature and this kind of seed pods and leaf skeletons, finding kind of graphic patterns in those. And many were looking to the same source material, like Ernst Haeckel's Art Forms in Nature or Darcy Wentworth Thompson's influential book on Growth and Form, all books which sort of sought to demonstrate the patterns and sequences that recurred in nature on a kind of micro and macroscopic level. So I think Rie's interest in kind of graphic pattern and geometry and some of her more linear and hard-edged designs still have this kind of organic interest. So to round off, I think that a re-examination of Rie's life and work really revealed that her work goes far beyond that of a purely metropolitan potter making pots for and inspired by the urban environment. Her interests and intimate knowledge of the natural world can be seen throughout her work, right up to these later pieces that bring together many of the techniques from her explosive volcanic glazes to the swirl, the spiral throwing technique. And I wanted to just finish with a quote from her close friend Cyril Frankel that he wrote after Rie's death in 1995, which I think really sums up her relationship to the natural world. Lucie Rie's creativity has enriched the world over with bowls and vases, each individual in form and surface, each having in common a rising upward thrust, seemingly reflecting her sharing of nature, of the growth of flowers towards the sun, of the running veins within a leaf, the timeless carving of a seashell, and sharing of her joy in making. Thank you.